Hey, what's up everyone? Today we are going to be reacting to a couple of videos tied together to the Gypsy Rose court case. And this whole story has been building for a long time, but has come back into the spotlight because Gypsy herself is supposed to be released from prison here in December. And so a lot of new videos from Law and Crime Network, from Dr. Phil, are kind of going through, again, some of the details of the case. And because there's so much going on in terms of abuse, mental health, different disorders that are pretty uncommon, I wanted to dive into that and go through some of these different sources to talk about some of the aspects that were going on in this case. So right now we're starting with the Law and Crime Network video. They do a really good job of setting up the parameters of the case and what was going on with it. So let's just dive into what they have for the background of the case here.
Now, more than 8 years later, she is set to walk out of prison a free woman. Thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy. Gypsy Blanchard admitted that she planned the murder of her mother, Claudine Dee Dee Blanchard, in 2015. That would usually land someone in prison for many, many years, if not the rest of their lives. But Gypsy Blanchard will be released in December, right after Christmas, after being granted parole. Gypsy Blanchard testified at the trial of her then-boyfriend, Nick Godejohn, in 2018. Gypsy and Nick met on a Christian dating website. Nick was Gypsy's first boyfriend. Gypsy said she wanted to kill her mom because her mom had abused her and held her captive.
And what was going on in your home life that made you reach the point where you did that or made that decision?
I was growing increasingly desperate to get out of my home life.
Did you tell Nick that?
Yes.
And what was your mom doing that caused you to be more desperate?
Things were getting physically and more physically abusive. The hitting was more. The starving was more.
Yeah, so if you're watching this, you probably know the background of the case, but for those who are new to this like I was, she's actually a good bit older than she appears. When Gypsy was in her 20s, her mom still had her pretending to be in her teens, to be physically ill with a bunch of different debilitating diseases so that she could garner sympathy and gain donations from charitable organizations. And I don't know what she would sound like if she had not gone through all that trauma in terms of the physical and emotional abuse, and how her body might have adjusted her voice and her body language to present as a lot younger than she physically might be.
Now, you mentioned you were in a wheelchair. Were you required to act any certain way when you were in a wheelchair?
Yes, sir.
How was that?
She would have me stay very quiet and pretend like I couldn't walk.
Gypsy said Dee Dee Blanchard told people that her daughter was a terminally ill teenager, when in fact she was perfectly healthy and in her 20s. Gypsy said her mother did this so she could garner sympathy and collect donations. When a parent convinces a child they are ill, it's called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and it's a form of abuse. The prosecutor told the jury that Nick Godejohn traveled from Wisconsin to Missouri to kill Dee Dee Blanchard at Gypsy's request.
So again, a little more background here, but this is kind of where the whole case began, where these two met on a dating app or a dating website, and somehow this plot came about for the boyfriend to come over to her house, kill the mom. And there's a lot of twisted stuff that goes on here. The boyfriend himself potentially had a very difficult history, in addition to what you've already heard about Gypsy Blanchard's upbringing and how her mom abused her. So there was a lot of fertile ground for something really messed up to happen here already.
There was only one way to get out from under the grasp of her mother, and that was to kill her mother. Gypsy formulated this plan, and she wavered on it. For a while, she was committed to it. Later, she decided, no, that's not the right thing. Nick was happy to do whatever Gypsy wanted. He was always compliant.
This is actually a really interesting thing for him to say, because what we'll touch on later was that there was a very unequal power dynamic between Gypsy and her boyfriend, just as there was between her and her mom. But when that gets brought up in the future, it's actually that the boyfriend in their relationship had all the power and she was compliant, which is actually the same pattern that, of course, she had with her mom. So that's definitely a very interesting dynamic. He makes her out to be the one who's the manipulator, the controller, and that the boyfriend was the one who was compliant in the relationship.
And finally, Gypsy said, "It's getting worse here. This has to be done." She stole some more money from her mother, provided that to Nick to come down on a bus and stay in a hotel. She stole a knife from Walmart so that Nick could use that as the murder weapon, and provided Nick with gloves and tape and everything he would need to go through with her plan. Nick arrived there at the house. Knife was ready, gloves were ready, tape was ready. He entered that home and saw Gypsy standing there. A girl who could walk, not someone captive in a wheelchair. Looking around the living room, there were wheelchairs. The devices that bound her. And Nick went through with Gypsy's plan.
So definitely setting her up to be the mastermind here. I think it's very easy to think like, well, she could actually walk. She was perfectly healthy. Why didn't she resist her mom at some point? And there is something to that dynamic of that abusive relationship where a lot of people, because that is what you've grown up in, especially children who are abused, that's what you know, you're used to feeling powerless. And even though you physically may have the capability of breaking free and doing something about it on your own, that sometimes it's scarier to step out into something that's unknown but might actually be better than just feeling that desperation and feeling to that kind of desperate lashing out like this plan was. And what seems to be the consensus is that while murder is not right, couldn't conceive of any other way to get out of this situation, because clearly a lot of the medical professionals who had prescribed a lot of these medications for the so-called conditions that she had, that her mother said she had, clearly didn't catch on that she was actually perfectly healthy. And I don't know enough about the background to be able to say, like, why didn't she just stand up during one of her doctor's appointments? But potentially there was a lot of physical and emotional retribution every time she stepped out of line from what her mother wanted. And that could have been enough to just keep her in that captive, helpless kind of state. So I'm going to switch over to the Dr. Phil clip and talk about some of that real quick.
The board in 2021.
What do you want to do with your life?
I want to be an advocate for abused children or abused people. If I would have known that there was something called Munchausen by proxy syndrome out there, perhaps it would have nudged me to get help from somebody, because I thought my mother was the only person like that. And so I want to speak about my experience to encourage people, if they're being abused, get help, because it can make a difference. And that way they won't end up like me.
This is a super helpful point, because as we talk about, well, why didn't she do something about it? She thought she was the only person who was struggling like this, who was in this kind of situation. She didn't know there was a name for it. She didn't know that there are categories and support for victims like her, for people who are stuck in that kind of abusive situation. And that's why advocacy and education are super important. That's why I put out some of these videos about very difficult things to talk about, so that people who watch that can recognize, if I'm in that situation, I'm not alone, I can get help. There are avenues for me to be able to seek help and support without resorting to extreme and potentially criminal measures. I'm glad that she can consider that now as advocacy, using her story to help other people who may be stuck in similar situations.
What do you think should happen to Nick?
I think that he should spend the rest of his life in prison.
Do you think he exploited you?
I think he did. I think he used me to have his own means. He was a lonely person, not a lot of friends. Girls would never look at him, so I was the only one that would never tell him no. I would always agree to everything he said and do it with a smile. And I think he saw that in me from living with my mother.
I think that's very insightful and a really good point. Whether it was intentional or not, this boyfriend, Nick, latched onto the fact that she was a very compliant person, that she had been taught this and trained in this by her mother to just go along, do whatever somebody wants and not rock the boat. And he clearly took advantage of that, whether that was due to a personality disorder, to childhood trauma, or to some other mental health condition. We don't know that for sure. But for people who have been in abusive relationships, whether romantic or parent-child, unless you put in that work of introspection, recognizing those patterns, maybe going to therapy, those individuals tend to end up in very similar relationships throughout their lives because that's just what they know. There's a level of comfort in that, even if it's very messed up, even if it's very twisted. And that's why it is important to have friends, trusted and close friends, that can point out some of those patterns to you and say like, hey, you are going from person to person and it's the same thing every time. Even though that might be a very hard and uncomfortable conversation to have, having those kinds of friends who can say that to you is invaluable. Or failing that, having a therapist who can say the same to you.
Like I had that submissive, low self-esteem, codependent personality that I think he could prey on that, and he used me.
And so there's already been a lot that's been rehashed about Gypsy Blanchard. What I want to touch on now a little bit is what was going on with the boyfriend. Some background that you'll hear upcoming in some of these clips is that he apparently at least believed that he had dissociative identity disorder, commonly known as multiple personality disorder. And we'll talk about some of the background of that later on. There's some concerns that he might have some kind of mild form of autism spectrum disorder, so maybe a high functioning individual on that spectrum, and how those diagnoses may have played a part in his suggestibility or in his culpability in this case.
Blanchard also testified about her sex life with Nick Godejohn.
You were asked a little bit about, during your relationship, these alter egos that the defendant and you came up with. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
His language is super important here, where he says these alters that you came up with. So alter is a term for when you have dissociative identity disorder. Those different identities that you switch between are called alters. They might not be fully formed identities, but a lot of them have their own mannerisms, their own way of speaking, their own way of thinking about things. And so it actually does feel like different people that you're talking to or that are inhabiting your body. But the way he phrases that you all came up with doesn't make it sound like he actually believes that there was something going on with the multiple personalities, even as he's trying to get her to say basically that she kind of played along, made up her own, and this was just storytelling. I've never had this guy Nick sit in front of me, and I don't know whether he's been formally diagnosed with DID. So that's not for me to say whether it's true or not, whether that's a convenient excuse or whether that's just what's going on with him. But let's dive more into it and see what she says.
It was the defendant who first introduced you to that idea of alter egos.
Yes, sir.
And he actually first told you about his alter ego, Victor. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And Victor was a vampire that was 500 years old.
Yes, sir.
And you decided to come up with your alter egos just to kind of please him.
Yes, sir.
And also, as part of this fantasy, you also started to kind of consider yourselves as master and slave, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the defendant was the master,
Yes, sir.
and you were the slave.
Yes, sir.
And so again, this is where those power dynamics seem flipped from what we had heard about before, where she was framed as a mastermind and he was the compliant one. And you'll see as she testifies that she's saying that, well, he was the one who was actually in charge by the roles that they even wrote out for themselves. Okay, now I want to dive into a little bit of background with Nick, the boyfriend, talking about what was going on in his interrogation after his arrest for the murder and some of what might have contributed to that.
Where's the first place you decided to stab her?
And I just was in a random spot in the back.
In the back, just random?
Yes.
Do you know how many times you stabbed her?
4.
You stabbed her 4?
Yeah, 4 times.
Okay.
The 4th one, I felt it go into, I think it might have been her lungs.
Okay.
It was harder to get out.
Okay.
So one thing I noticed right away, he's talking about what for most people would be a very stressful situation, very flat affect. When he holds up his hand for 4, like he's not emoting. All he's doing is, it looks like having a very normal conversation. Even being in an interrogation room, being under arrest, I'm not seeing obvious signs of stress. He's just looking at the same point the whole time. His eyes aren't darting around. His body language is pretty still. He's not emoting much.
Did it take one hand to get it out, two hands?
I had to yank it out.
Okay.
With one hand.
Okay. So it did. So the others came out easy, but that one kind of came out harder.
Yep.
So if you rewind the clip a little bit and look back, the interrogator is actually more demonstrative than the suspect is, and potentially she's exhibiting some of the stress of talking about a brutal murder, multiple stabbings, and being face to face with this guy, which he doesn't look like he's handcuffed either. And so just that contrast is very obvious when you take a closer look at it. A couple of things in terms of his potential mental health diagnoses. Again, I don't know for sure what he might or might not be diagnosed with. If he does indeed have dissociative identity disorder, one possibility is that he could be experiencing depersonalization, where it feels like someone else, his alter, might have been in the driver's seat at the time of the murder. So if he is in his Nick alter right now, and then let's say, for example, maybe the vampire alter was in the driver's seat at the time of the murder, it wouldn't feel like he had actually committed the murder. Now, it's hard to say how demonstrative he would be about one of his alters committing a murder, but it wouldn't feel like he had done it. Another possibility is, depending on how far along on the spectrum he is in terms of autism, he might just have a flat affect as part of that. That's entirely possible as well. And it doesn't necessarily indicate anything about him being a psychopath or a sociopath or not having a conscience necessarily. It could be the case. Again, I'm not here to diagnose him. I'm just relaying what I'm seeing and what I have heard in other videos about the case and about him.
Okay. And so, you only stabbed her 4 times? Are you sure about that?
Well, as in stabbing, I stabbed her.
Okay.
But I did actually cut her one other time besides that.
Okay, where'd you cut her
On
at?
the back of her neck.
Okay. And did you use the same knife that you did the others with?
Yep.
Okay. And when you did the cross the back of the neck, did that even cause an injury, or did you see any blood or anything?
Yeah, she was bleeding.
Okay, she's bleeding. And so did she scream or holler? Or
Yeah, she did.
what was she saying?
First she said help, and then she didn't recognize who I was, and she said,
Okay.
who are you? And then
Okay, so one of the features of dissociative identity disorder is sometimes there is memory loss, blanks of space where there's another alter kind of in the driver's seat. And so the original self or the original person doesn't actually remember what their alter was doing. He seems to have pretty good recall of that. And while DID is very individual, so everyone presents very differently, for me, in my mind, that's an argument against him actually having multiple personalities, because he seems to have pretty good recall of what happened, or at the very least, that it wasn't some alter committing the murder at the time. So we're going to jump ahead to a psychologist, I believe it is, testifying about his upbringing and his childhood.
His father reported to me that there was some indication his mother might have drank during the pregnancy, and there might have been some drug use. He knew about one occasion for each. The birth was complicated. She was in labor, I think for 13 hours, and the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck. And they used a suction cup to deliver him, and the doctors told his father that his brain may have been deprived of oxygen for a period of time during the delivery.
Okay, so just talking about the birth experience, really difficult circumstances, potentially alcohol and drug abuse in utero, which affects the fetus's development. And then you're talking about potentially being deprived of oxygen very early on. I know these are like really obvious red flags and problems when it comes to a pregnancy and a birth, but a lot of times we forget how closely intertwined our bodies are with our minds. When we have physical trauma, such as what Gypsy experienced, or in any of these other cases, like with the Frankie children or with Farader's kid, our minds are affected by what our bodies go through and vice versa. So it's really important to keep that in mind. It's not just during pregnancy, but also later on after the birth. What happens to our bodies can also strongly influence our minds, and the other way around. Okay, final clips here. This is from an A&E documentary about this case. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Nick and what was going on with him.
But there was no talk of going that easy on Nicholas Godejohn, even though a first-degree murder charge was going to be difficult to prove.
There was the misconception that what Mr. Godejohn did was sort of this act of chivalry, that he did it to save Gypsy from this situation. That was going to be a challenge to overcome. And then ultimately overcoming the defense, the fact that Mr. Godejohn did have autism. May it please the court.
Yes.
Outside of Claudine Blanchard's bedroom door stood the defendant, dressed in all black, wearing blue latex gloves, holding a knife. For the defendant, he was in love with Gypsy Blanchard, Claudine's daughter. And as he stood there, the only thing that stood between him being with Gypsy was Claudine.
The key for the prosecution was to show that Godejohn, looking much heavier since his arrest, had the mental capacity to make his own decisions, autism or not.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely something that a psychologist could assess, whether he was competent to make his own decisions. And I'm sure that would have been something that would have been screened earlier on in the process. That should have been pretty open and shut, that a psychologist would be able to testify whether or not he could be held liable for his actions.
And so it really came down to this this autism that Mr. Godejohn had. He had two thoughts. A benevolent thought that he described as an angel on one shoulder that said, just take Gypsy and run, and a malevolent thought, a devil on the other shoulder that said, the bitch is dead. Yes, this was Gypsy's idea, but the defendant on June 10th was ready to kill.
I've never heard of autism spectrum disorder being associated with murder. Now, children who are autistic might tend to have outbursts, emotional outbursts that can be very physical, because a lot of times, especially younger children, they might not have the language to be able to express their emotions, so it comes out physically. But for something premeditated like this, I've never heard of autism spectrum disorder associated with that. I'm surprised that the defense didn't actually go more with the dissociative identity disorder, which, if proven, would have been a more solid case for maybe some leniency in this case for an alter having committed the murder. But that leads me to think that maybe that was disproven, or he admitted that he was making something up, because they didn't go that route in his defense. So the final thing I want to look at is the interrogator's response to his testimony and his interview.
On cross-examination, Godejohn's lawyers tried to suggest Detective Mahoney had taken advantage of him.
Did you know that he was on the autism spectrum?
No, sir.
Had you received any kind of information that he was on the autism spectrum?
No, sir.
Now, this particular interview took place right after midnight.
Yes, sir.
And he seemed tired to you, is that correct?
At times when he would say he was tired, he did appear that he might be tired.
Did that cause you to question whether you should continue to question him, given the fact that he was tired and it was after midnight?
No, sir. Being tired is not a deal breaker on an interview.
I do feel like also, assuming this was right after his arrest, he should have been informed that he could have chosen to have a lawyer with him. Now again, autism is on a spectrum, so it's not to say that all people who are autistic are unable to represent themselves or conduct themselves properly during a legal proceeding. So again, that might be a good technicality to point out, that if a psychologist could testify that maybe he was being taken advantage of, that he wasn't able to make decisions independently, which ties to his overall defense that he's not able to stand trial for his actions or be responsible for them. But again, that would be up to a professional to assess.
Godejohn's case was not helped when the jury saw a jailhouse interview he did with a TV reporter while he awaited trial, when he wasn't tired, and also admitted to the murder, describing his deliberations.
Well, that's not going to help your case. That's just not.
The darker part of me was also in love with the darker part of her. And because of it, the thought was, excuse my French, but it basically said, this bitch is dead.
Yeah, well, I guess that's going to settle it for the prosecution. So, tough case all around, a lot of layers. And thank you for joining me and walking through some of the mental health issues at play here. There's a lot with abusive relationships, with different mental health diagnoses and how those intertwine with violence. I think there is something to be said also for the healthcare system having failed Gypsy Blanchard, and that she was going to see doctors. She was being prescribed a lot of medications, all based on the report of her mother. And apparently there were a lot of side effects of these medications that actually caused physical problems for her, which is absolutely the opposite intention of what those drugs are for. And so that's a reminder for medical professionals and mental health care professionals that we need to be aware. We need to be conducting our own independent assessment rather than solely relying on what a parent is telling us. So that's a very difficult situation to be able to unravel, because the mom apparently had so much wrapped up in having her daughter be this terminally ill patient who is perpetually a teenager and getting all this sympathy and soliciting all of these donations. Again, I do want to go back to what Gypsy had said earlier on in the video, that advocacy and education is super important, even for things that are relatively uncommon, because sometimes when those things are so uncommon, it becomes a lot easier to start thinking that you're the only person experiencing it, and so often that's not the case. So thank you all for checking out this video. Please like and subscribe. That helps our channel to grow and to continue putting out content. We are doing live streams every week, so be sure to tune in. We'll always have announcements on the community tab for when those will be scheduled, so you can make sure to check those out. We do a live Q&A so we can talk about different subjects that are mattering to you at the moment. So thank you all for checking out this video. I'll see you next time.